All right, back for another deep dive. And honestly, this one kind of freaks me out a little bit.
Ew.
Yeah, the whole free will thing. Do we actually choose anything or are we just on autopilot? Like, am I really me?
Deep stuff. Well, good thing our listeners sent in some juicy bits from The Consciousness Instinct by Michael Gazzaniga.
Perfect timing, too, right when I'm having an existential crisis.
Well, Gazzaniga doesn't pull any punches, that's for sure. He even brings up this thought experiment from Sam Harris
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
about something as mundane as picking coffee over tea.
Okay, everyday choice.
Right. And Harris suggests those seemingly simple choices might already be baked in,
Yeah.
like predetermined by our brain activity.
So, like, I think I like coffee, but maybe it's just neurons firing in some pre-programmed sequence.
Yes, sir.
That's a bit unnerving.
It is a bit unsettling. But Gazzaniga, he doesn't stop there. He dives into these wild neurological cases.
Oh, yeah, the ones where people literally can't perceive parts of the world, even their own bodies sometimes.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's called neglect. And those cases, especially with split brain patients, they really challenge our assumptions about, being in control.
Okay, so for folks who don't know, split brain patients are those who've had their brain hemispheres surgically separated.
Right. And it creates this fascinating situation where one side of the brain acts on information the other side never even knew about.
It's like having two separate consciousnesses in one head, almost.
In a way, yeah. Gazzaniga gives this example of a patient who sees a snowy scene with one hemisphere
Okay.
and then chooses a shovel. Seems logical, right?
Yeah, for shoveling snow.
But here's the kicker. They then explain their choice by saying it's for cleaning a chicken shed.
What? Why a chicken shed?
Because that's what the other hemisphere, the one doing the talking, happened to see. It had no clue about the snow.
So it's like our brains are making decisions, and then our conscious minds are just making up stories to explain them after the fact. Kind of like a PR team for our subconscious.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. And it makes you wonder how much of our decision-making is happening behind the scenes with our conscious mind just playing catch-up.
Like, we think we're in the driver's seat, but really we're just passengers.
Maybe. And this whole thing, it ties into that debate about subconscious priming, which Gazzaniga digs into as well.
Oh, yeah, those studies about, like, seeing a briefcase and suddenly becoming more competitive. Or seeing a library and getting all quiet.
Yeah, those, except, well, remember how we were talking about questioning everything?
Always.
Well, some of that priming research actually fell apart.
Really? Like, it was debunked.
Yeah. It turns out a lot of those studies couldn't be replicated, and some even turned out to be fraudulent.
No way. So even the science studying our minds can be unreliable. This is getting meta.
It is, and this is where it gets even more fascinating. Daniel Kahneman, the guy who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow.
The one with System 1 and System 2 thinking.
The very same. Well, he was a huge proponent of priming, but he eventually admitted he was wrong about its influence.
Wow. So we're supposed to be skeptical of our own minds, but now we can't even trust the science studying those minds. Where does that leave us? Gazzaniga must have a better explanation for why we do what we do.
He does, and it's actually pretty simple. He points out how ridiculous it would be if we were constantly mystified by our own behavior.
True. I guess we're pretty good at explaining ourselves usually.
Exactly. We explain our actions all the time, to ourselves, to others. It's how we make sense of the world.
And it's how we learn how we interact socially. Makes sense.
Right. So instead of assuming some hidden puppeteer is pulling our strings, Gazzaniga suggests we look at how the strings got there in the first place.
Okay, so going back to the brain's evolution.
Exactly. He takes us way, way back, showing how cognitive abilities became more complex over millions of years.
So from like single-celled organisms reacting to light all the way to humans writing symphonies.
Exactly. He talks about cognitive depth, you see. A simple organism just reacts to immediate stimuli, but as brains evolve, they could process information on more abstract levels.
So like a worm just knows food or danger. But humans can plan for retirement, write poetry, or even ponder this whole free will conundrum.
That's it. Huge jump in cognitive depth. And a key factor was the expansion of the cortex, especially in primates and humans. This allowed for abstract thought, the creation of categories, and understanding cause and effect.
So our brains became capable of building mental models, not just of the world, but of ourselves in the world.
Precisely. And that is a game changer, because now we can step back and analyze why we make certain choices, then adjust based on the outcome. We become less reactive, more strategic.
Okay, so it's not just about making a choice, but about knowing how sure we are about that choice. Is that what he's saying?
Yes. He brings up this concept of certainty. Our brains generate signals representing how certain we are about our beliefs and decisions. It's vital for learning and updating our mental models.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like if I'm walking in the woods and hear a rustle, my brain immediately assesses the possibility of danger. But the level of certainty changes everything. Is it just the wind or a bear about to pounce? That impacts how I react, how quickly I need to move.
Exactly. Certainty shapes our actions. And Gazaniga points to a specific part of the brain where a lot of this certainty processing happens,
Which is?
the prefrontal cortex. Think of it as the executive suite, responsible for higher order cognitive control. Planning, goal management, inhibiting impulses, working memory, and yes, evaluating certainty, it all happens there.
So damage to that area would really mess with the person's decision-making.
Absolutely. He mentions cases where prefrontal damage leads to people struggling with planning, impulse control, adapting to new rules. It's a big deal.
This is sounding a lot like Kahneman System 1 and System 2 thinking, right?
You got it. System 1, the automatic, relying on learned behaviors and habits, and System 2, kicking in for novel or complex situations where conscious effort is needed.
So even with tons of automatic processes running, we can still consciously step in when needed.
That seems to be the case, at least some of the time. Which brings us to another huge question. The role of consciousness itself. Why are we aware of some things our brain does, but not others?
All right, now we're getting really deep. What does Gazaniga say about that?
Well, he seems to think consciousness acts like a filter, highlighting the most important information for us to focus on.
Kind of like a spotlight on the mental stage.
That's a great way to put it, and that selectivity is crucial for effective decision-making.
Right, imagine being aware of every single thought and sensation all the time. It'd be overwhelming.
Exactly. Consciousness lets us focus on what matters, make choices without getting bogged down in every detail.
Like that experiment where people are so focused on counting basketball passes that they completely miss a gorilla walking by. It's mind-blowing how attention shapes what we consciously experience.
Absolutely. But then, if consciousness is so selective, why even have it? Why did it evolve in the first place? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It's like, what's the evolutionary advantage of being aware of only a tiny sliver of what our brains are doing?
Gazaniga connects it to some of our most unique human abilities. Our capacity to imagine, to use language, to share thoughts with others, to build complex cultures.
Yeah, none of that would be possible without consciousness.
Right. It's like consciousness gave us this inner world of thoughts and possibilities, letting us go beyond just reacting to our immediate surroundings.
Okay, that makes sense. But I still have one major hang-up with all of this.
Yeah.
This whole mind-body problem thing. How can thoughts, which seem immaterial, actually cause physical actions in the world? It seems like a contradiction.
Yeah, the classic mind-body problem. And Gazaniga tackles it head on. He says the problem comes from misunderstanding what thoughts are.
Oh.
They're not immaterial. They are physically instantiated in our brains as patterns of neural activity.
So it's not like there's a little ghost in my head pulling levers and making me do stuff.
Not quite. It's the meaning encoded in those neural patterns that matters, the information they represent.
So our thoughts have power because they carry meaning.
Exactly. And that meaning influences activity in other parts of the brain, ultimately leading to action.
So no need for some mystical free will force outside the laws of physics. It's all happening within this amazingly complex network of neurons firing and connecting.
That seems to be the picture emerging from neuroscience. But it does raise another interesting question, doesn't it?
Which is?
If this conscious control is all about our brains, does everyone have it to the same degree?
Good point. We've all met people who seem to have endless willpower while others struggle.
Right, and it's not just between people, it varies across the lifespan too.
Like babies are basically pure impulse.
Exactly. But as we develop, we gain more control over our emotions and actions.
Which brings us to the famous marshmallow test.
Ah, the classic experiment. Seeing if kids can resist that delicious treat for a bigger reward later.
Even though the original findings about its predictive power have been challenged, it still highlights that there are differences in how we deal with delayed gratification.
Right. Absolutely. So the question becomes, what determines those differences? Are some people just born with more willpower?
Are we stuck with the brain we're born with? Nature versus nurture again.
It's probably a bit of both. Gazaniga suggests it's a combination of genes, brain development, and life experiences that shape our self-control abilities. It's complex.
Yeah, trying to pinpoint exactly which genes or experiences contribute the most, that's got to be incredibly difficult.
It is. And Gazaniga mentions how research has struggled to find strong correlations between cognitive tests and real-world behavior.
Makes sense. It's hard to capture the messiness of real life in a lab setting.
Exactly. So even if we could perfectly map every neuron in the brain, predicting someone's choices would still be a challenge.
So much for that sci-fi future of pre-crime units reading our minds.
Right. And to make things even more complex, there are many psychiatric conditions that can affect self-regulation in different ways.
Like ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, even addiction, right? Each impacting a person's ability to control their thoughts and actions differently.
Precisely. The variety of these conditions really underscores the complexity of free will. It's not one simple thing, it's this intricate interplay of brain functions, each with its own biological basis.
So maybe instead of asking, do we have free will, we should be asking how much, in what ways, and under what circumstances. It's not a yes or no question.
That's a great way to frame it. And it's exactly the kind of nuanced thinking Gazaniga encourages us to bring to this whole discussion. It really makes you think, though, doesn't it? With all this talk about brain function, variations in self-control, what does it even mean to be responsible for our actions?
Yeah, that's the big question lurking under all of this, isn't it? If it's our brains making the choices, not some separate mind, does it even make sense to blame people?
Gazaniga doesn't shy away from that at all. He argues that even with all these biological factors at play, we do have a degree of conscious control.
Okay, so we're not just puppets of our neurons.
Right. But it's tricky because so much of what we do is driven by habit, learned responses, things below our awareness.
It's like, I know I should eat healthy, but when that donut is staring me down, sometimes my brain just yells, sugar rush. Where's the conscious control in that moment?
Exactly. He points out the skepticism about free will might come partly from that old idea of mind-body dualism.
That they're separate.
Yeah. But if we ditch that, if we accept that thoughts are physical processes in the brain,
then it's not so weird that they can have real effects on our bodies and the world around us.
Exactly. It's not about thoughts being immaterial and magically pulling levers. The meaning encoded in those neural patterns, that's what influences other brain areas and leads to action.
Okay, so no need for some mystical free will force outside the laws of physics. It's all happening within this amazingly complex brain network. But doesn't that kind of make us sound like robots, just programmed by our genes and environment?
Gazaniga cautions against that too. Just because thoughts are grounded in physical stuff doesn't mean we can reduce them only to that.
So it's not that simple.
Right. The meaning, the experience that matters too.
It's like saying a great novel is just ink on paper. Technically true, but it's the story that makes it powerful.
Perfect analogy. He calls this view cognitive realism, acknowledging the mind-brain connection without resorting to the supernatural or reducing ourselves to mere machines.
So kind of middle ground. We're biological beings, but the meaning we create, that matters.
Right. And this has huge implications for how we see ourselves as agents in the world. If we can reflect on our thoughts, shape them consciously, we have some control over our lives.
Not every action is some big philosophical decision, though. Like, I don't consciously choose to blink every few seconds, thank goodness.
Of course not. But Gazaniga's point is, we do have this oversight capacity. We can intervene when needed, especially in new or challenging situations.
Okay, so like resisting that donut.
Exactly. Or making plans, sticking to them, even when it's hard. Things that take effort, the things we usually associate with being responsible people. But remember earlier we were talking about how that capacity varies from person to person.
Right, some folks just seem to have way more willpower.
Yes, and Gazaniga reminds us those individual differences likely come from a mix of genetics, brain development, and life experiences. It's not as simple as saying someone is just a bad person.
Which has big implications for things like criminal justice.
Right.
If someone's brain is wired for less impulse control, is punishment the right response?
Tough questions for sure. Gazaniga suggests our legal and ethical systems have to grapple with these neuroscience findings.
It's not about letting people off the hook, though, right?
No, it's about understanding the root causes of behavior to find more effective solutions.
So, like, maybe instead of just jail time, someone needs therapy or medication to address those underlying issues.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of someone intentionally breaking a vase versus accidentally knocking it over.
Same outcome, different level of responsibility.
Right. And this applies to so many areas: education, social policy, even how we treat each other on a daily basis.
It's like he's pushing for a more compassionate and more scientific understanding of why people do what they do.
Absolutely. Instead of good versus evil, it's about recognizing we're all complex beings shaped by a ton of factors, some within our control, some not.
But if so much is beyond our conscious control, can we even change? Are we stuck with the brain we're born with?
Here's the good news. While genes and early experiences lay the foundation around, Gazzaniga says our brains are remarkably plastic throughout life,
Plastic.
meaning they can change, adapt, we can learn, rewire ourselves to some extent.
So even if I'm like prone to procrastination, I'm not doomed. There's hope.
There is. It means self-control isn't just some fixed trait. It's a skill that can be developed with practice.
Okay, so like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. He even mentions research on mindfulness, meditation, cognitive training techniques, things that actually show promise in boosting self-regulation.
So maybe we don't have perfect, unlimited free will, but we do have the power to shape our minds, which then shapes our lives.
That's the takeaway. It's not about being completely unconstrained, but about consciously choosing our direction within the constraints we do have.
Like, we're both the author and the editor of our own story. We don't control all the raw material, but we get to craft the narrative.
Beautifully put. Gazzaniga's exploration really makes us rethink what it means to be an agent in the world, to be responsible.
We've come a long way from split brain patients to the evolution of the mind itself. But before we get too carried away with all this self-determination, Gazzaniga throws in one final thought.
Oh, yes. He reminds us that our individual choices always play out within a larger social context.
Right. We're not just isolated brains making decisions in a vacuum. The people around us, our culture, the systems we live in, all of that matters too.
And he says understanding those social influences is just as important as understanding our own minds.
So it's not enough to just work on my own willpower. I have to pay attention to the systems that might be making it harder or easier to make good choices.
Exactly. He's calling for this dual awareness of both our inner landscape and the social landscape that shapes our options.
Which is tricky, because sometimes those systems are rigged against us even if we don't realize it.
That's where it gets challenging. But even recognizing those influences is a step toward making more informed choices, both for ourselves and for creating a more just society.
So it's about personal responsibility and social responsibility. We're all interconnected in the end.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance, but navigating these two landscapes, the inner and the outer, that's what leads to choices that are both meaningful and have positive ripple effects.
Wow, Gazzaniga has given us a lot to think about.
He has, from split brains to social systems, the evolution of the mind, and what it all means for our understanding of free will. It's been quite a journey.
And this is just scratching the surface. But hopefully this deep dive has sparked some new questions for you and for our listeners out there about the nature of choice and responsibility.
If folks are feeling a little mind blown right now, that's a good sign, right? It means the gears are turning.
It makes you wonder, all the stuff we've been talking about, how does it apply to bigger issues, like social justice, for example?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really complicated.
Right, because if our choices are so influenced by factors we don't even realize, how does that change how we think about blame, punishment, rehabilitation, all that?
Gazzaniga definitely doesn't shy away from those tough questions. In fact, he suggests our legal and ethical systems, they really need to catch up with what neuroscience is revealing.
So are you saying we should just let everyone off the hook for bad behavior because, oh, their brains made them do it? That doesn't seem right either.
No, it's not about absolving responsibility completely. It's more about recognizing that not everyone starts with the same capacity for self-control or rational decision-making.
Okay, so not everyone's brain is created equal, in a sense.
Right. And those differences, they often stem from things totally beyond a person's conscious awareness.
So it's less about are they guilty, and more about why do they do it. Trying to understand the context behind their actions.
Exactly. It's about the why behind the action, not just judging the outcome. Like, imagine someone struggling with addiction. Their brain's reward system, it's basically been hijacked, right? Makes it incredibly hard to resist cravings, even when they desperately want to.
So punishing them for using might not actually address the underlying problem?
Exactly. It's like that saying, treat the disease, you win. Treat the symptoms, you lose.
But how do you even begin to apply this kind of thinking to something as complex as the legal system? Where do you even start?
Yeah, Gazzaniga admits it's messy. There are no easy answers. He's not advocating for just throwing out the whole system, but rather pushing for a more nuanced approach.
One that takes the science into account.
Right. Less about black and white judgments and more about how do we help people make better choices in the future.
That does seem a lot more constructive. More humane, even.
And it's not just about crime either. This applies to education, social policy, even just how we interact with each other on a personal level, day to day.
Yeah, if we understood better that people's choices are influenced by things they may not even be aware of, it calls for a lot more empathy, doesn't it?
A lot more understanding, that's for sure. Instead of judging someone for being lazy or impulsive, maybe we consider what life experiences or even just like brain differences might be contributing.
It's not about excusing bad behavior, but recognizing everyone's fighting their own internal battles.
Then some of those battles are a lot harder for some people than others.
So Gazzaniga is really pushing us to think beyond these simple categories of good and bad, right? To have a more compassionate and informed view of what it means to be human.
He is. It's what makes his work so interesting, I think. Combines rigorous science with a real appreciation for the complexities of, well, just being a person.
And he doesn't leave us on a totally bleak note either, right? There's still hope.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We might not have perfect free will in that absolute sense that philosophers have argued about for centuries.
But we're not powerless either.
Right. We have the ability to reflect on our choices, to learn from our mistakes. We can even change our brains for the better. That's the amazing thing.
And we can create systems, social systems, that support those efforts rather than just punishing people for struggling.
Exactly. That's a powerful message, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to chew on. From split brains to social systems, the evolution of the mind, and what it all means for how we understand this whole idea of free will.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn about ourselves and how our brains create this experience of being human.
That's what we're all about here on The Deep Dive, right? Giving folks the tools to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep expanding their understanding of the world.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing. And if this exploration of free will sparked any big questions for you, we'd love to hear them. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and keep diving deeper.
That's it for this episode of